Good afternoon, everyone. We're so glad to have you here at After Dark at All Saints, and we're delighted to have Dr. Barbara Thiede here, our resident rabbi, we like to say, and of course the other Dr. Thiede is here too, Rolf. We're so glad to have you. And so Barbara has been here so many times, and we're so delighted to have her again. She's going to talk about love and laughter in the Hebrew Bible. Yes. And so she's, as we know, she's going to offer us a bit of humor. And you were supposed to bring your romanticism with you today. I hope you did. So she's known as the rabbi in residence here at UNCC. Recently, she also became known as the hopping rabbi. And so I'll let her tell you about that. But Barbara, we're so glad to have you. Please welcome Rabbi Barbara Thiede.
Thanks, Chuck. Oh, goodness, hopping. We just have to kind of make things physical. And one of the students at a talk I gave asked me about what Judaism thought in regard to a topic. And I said, well, which one? This Judaism or this Judaism or this Judaism or this Judaism? So I am now known as not so much the hopping rabbi, but the hopping professor, but at least I wasn't hopping mad. There you go. So, my friends, I thought before we actually start with the PowerPoint presentation, it's always a good idea to get a sense of what do you know, right? I do this with my students sometimes where I just say, okay, what do you know about? What do you think you know about? So I want to find out what you associate with laughter in the Hebrew Bible, like things where you just said, oh, that was the most hilarious text I ever read. And if there's dead silence, I will understand. And there'd be a reason for that. But is there anything you remember as being outright funny that made you laugh out loud when you read it? Talking donkey. Yes. Shrek's ancient friend there. That donkey, she is pretty funny. Absolutely. Okay. Yes, Nancy. Uh-huh. Mm-hmm.
But don't be afraid. And I can just imagine her going, what are you talking about? And it makes me kind of chuckle that this entity appears and then says, don't be afraid.
Because, angels are kind of scary, actually, in most of the Hebrew Bible. Now, of course, we just had a reference to the New Testament or the Greek Bible, but that doesn't mean that similarly amusing moments don't happen in the Hebrew Bible, because this does happen where there are like various annunciations where angels come down and say, to a woman, this indeed shall happen to you, or this indeed shall not happen to you. And and also with this kind of sudden surprise. So there's a bit of precedent there. Not exactly, but close. Yeah. Okay. Anything else? Yes. Becca.
Whenever God told Noah to build the ark, and that's, there was no rain, it was in the middle of nowhere, and just imagining like what he went through, and because I've been in similar situations where God asked me to do something, and I'm like, that's funny. So I can kind of relate to that.
Yes, there are people who say that the deity has like a wild sense of humor. Build an ark, nothing's happening, but trust me, you'll need it. Okay, I've got something from, yes, Brian.
I think it's funny when God appears to Moses as a burning bush. I mean, Moses is just walking around, all of a sudden this little bush bursts into flames, and God is there talking to him from a bush.
Mm-hmm. Either funny or really, really scary. Yeah. Yes, over here, Chuck, we have someone.
This was something I just recently found out about in forget which of the prophets it's in, but Elisha is getting teased by children and curses them, and two she-bears come out of the middle of nowhere and maul them. And I just thought, this is disturbing, but also very, like they're laughing at him. I don't know.
They call him Baldy.
Yeah.
And for that, he sicks some nasty animals on them, and 42 children die.
And
It's dark humor in the extreme. Yes. Yes, I'm noticing that there are a lot of dark humor moments here. So now you can understand maybe why Jews are renowned for dark humor. I mean, given the, yes. Yes, sir.
Okay, well, I like Sarah's reaction when God said, "You're going to have a baby," when she was like 100, you know. So she's kind of like, yeah, she wasn't having it.
That is a funnier moment than we think. Okay, so there were a lot of things which I completely forgot to write down here. But yes, Sarah's response and guys being called Baldy that's literal. He's called Baldy, right? And don't do this to a prophet is the, right? This to any prophets. Okay, and then things like God saying to Noah, you know, build this large object for no particular reason that I can actually explain to you that will make sense, and the various other ones. All right. So we have
Jacob's
yeah.
bride exchange.
Yeah, gosh. Again, you know, is this funny for Laban? It might be. The bride exchange. I mean, are you noticing how many of these actually do have kind of a dark side to them? Yeah, there is that. All right, what about love? When we say the word love, what do we associate that with in terms of Hebrew Bible? And again, for you, even though it's not exactly the same text, keep in mind that I'm referring to what you mostly understand as the Old Testament, even though we've had this kind of conversation that those texts aren't exactly one-to-one, but they're pretty close. So love in those texts, in biblical texts. Yes, Brian.
I think of Ruth and Boaz.
Ruth and Boaz. Oh boy, I have students who are going to be doing some study on Ruth and Boaz just for this Tuesday night, and that's a complicated story. Though we think about that as a kind of, you know, lovely little idyll. If we ever want this, we should try to do Ruth and just the whole story of Ruth and the weird, wonderful, scary, disturbing, inspiring, serious things that are going on there. But yeah, okay, we do generally associate Boaz as having some love for Ruth. Whether Boaz does or not might be a big question mark. Okay. Anything else? Love in Hebrew Bible? The Song of Songs, which is the one text I won't be talking to you about today. And why not? Because like the book of Ruth, love in the Song of Songs is its own kind of interesting thing, and it would take a separate study to look at that. So for those who are interested, that might be a summer project too. Okay, anything else? From narrative texts other than Song of Songs, which is, of course, poetry in that.
Hosea and Gomer.
Oh, goodness, that's a dark love. Go marry a prostitute and then tell her you will have nothing to do with her and then bring her back. Oh, my goodness, Chuck. Well, okay. Any love that isn't dark? Nobody can think. David and Jonathan. And I will say here that it's Jonathan for David, because I've written a lot about this. I continue to write a lot about this. And I think Jonathan does love David, but David is a dude who doesn't, everybody loves David. Everybody, his courtiers, Saul loves David, Jonathan loves David, Michal loves David, everybody loves David. And David is never said to have loved anyone, trust me, which is interesting, except one person or one character, God. And that relationship is like, and then there's all sorts of interesting things. But that's in my third book, in case you're interested in like having more than you actually bargained for in me. But okay, anything else? But Jonathan definitely does love David. Yeah, Brian.
One last thing, the first commandment, the Lord your God is one. Mm-hmm. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and mind and soul.
The students who anticipate me are so cool. You have no idea how important it is what you just said, but very cool that you did. Okay, so obviously Deuteronomy 6, 4 through 9, actually 5 through 9 is what Brian was quoting. All right, so that said, let's see what happens when we actually get there on all of these texts, okay? So, laughter. What does laughter even mean in biblical Hebrew? And I think it's really important for us to look at this. Is this in the way of people, by the way? No? You can all see? All right. So laughter can mean the joyous kind of laughter, but laughter can also be used in just the same way that we use it in English, right? You can have laughter that is disdainful. You can have laughter that is skeptical. You can have laughter that is mocking, that is toying with others, right? It has that full range of emotional valence just in the same way we do in English. And frequently, I'm sorry to say, that some of the darker sides of laughter, the jesting, the mocking, or the playing with others, is where we find that word showing up in the Hebrew Bible. Fortunately, it's not the only place, though. So we have, for example, laughter used over and over again in the Isaac story. And I know that there have been points in our, decade-long relationship where I've mentioned to you that Isaac's name is actually from the root for laughter. It means laughter, and his birth is a laughing matter to people who are way too old to do, let alone, you fill it in, right? And I'm not kidding about the do part. I'll get to that in a minute. So, they all laugh. Abraham laughs and Sarah laughs, right? And there's laughter in that story that's the dark kind when Ishmael is mockingly making fun of Isaac. He mitzacheks him, and that's the same root, tzachak, where he is mocking him at his weaning. The jealous older brother, I've mentioned to you, life cycles are always a place where people either act beautifully or they act the worst they ever could, right? Life cycle events. Like here we have a weaning, Ishmael is jealous, he mocks his little brother. And we have Avimelech associated with viewing Isaac when he's all grown up, playing. This kind of laughter is used in a very sexually resonant way. He is making sport with Rebecca, and that's where that root actually gets used. Again, it's still the same root as the word for just plain laughter. This comes up again in the Potiphar story. Again, that laughter which can have this association with sexual and somewhat transgressive behaviors. And the last example there, which is really quite painful, is when the Philistines effectively demand that Samson dance for them. This root comes up again, right? To make sport, to be a cause of laughter, right? He's chained or he's bound or he is in one way or another effectively subject to onlookers who are making him perform for them. So those are the dark sides of laughter that feel pretty uncomfortable for most of us. And yet, oh gosh, I knew this was going to happen. For some reason, some fonts in Hebrew come out on your screen like this. What this really actually says, though, is something close to what's in the English, where Abraham says, "What? You've got to be joking," right? Can anybody possibly imagine that I, as old as I am, can possibly engender a child? Or Sarah, can she bear a child at the age of 90? And trust me when I say that the Q, the X, the apostrophe, the underlining, the C, the Y, the L, the W is actually the Hebrew for laughter. I'm sorry about the font. Can you help me figure this out? I don't know why this keeps happening sometimes. It's at home. They don't have the font here, that's why? I see. All right. All right, so there we have a first example of the Isaac story being hilarious. And here we have exactly what you mentioned, sir, which is Sarah laughing to herself. Now that I'm withered, am I supposed to have enjoyment, right, with my husband so old? Now, how many of you have seen me talk about this verse before? No one? Okay, well, great, she says, hopping again. So Sarah's language here in the Hebrew is more literally, she says, that she has dried up. Yes, there's a reason for that eyebrow going up, and I understand it, because we all know that as we age, things happen to our bodies, right? And postmenopausal women are literally drying up in the sense of being able to give life. There are physical ramifications here, which I won't get into, but that is probably what Sarah is describing. And what is also interesting is that she says, am I to have Aden, or Edna is actually the word that's used here, which comes from the root Aden. And Aden, does that sound familiar to you, that word? Aden? Pronounce it Eden? You're on. That word actually means pleasure. And it means an erotic pleasure. And as I was just telling a student last week, in the ancient world, a Garden of Eden, pleasure gardens, were actually part and parcel of what kings would make for themselves. And yes, did people have fun in those gardens? Yes. So they were associated with sexual pleasure, and they were associated with play of this kind. And she says, she's laughing, can I have this sexual pleasure with my husband so old? You got this? You got this. She's dried up, and her husband has problems with, yes. This is one of the most hilarious moments in Hebrew Bible, because she's naming a complete reality that does happen to us, as we age, that our bodies don't function as they did when they were young. And she is actually being so raw and honest and funny here that if you actually read this in the Hebrew, you will laugh out loud, because it's kind of it's a stand-up comedy moment. Yeah, I'm this and he's that. You've got to be joking. And in another PowerPoint, which I could have sworn I had presented in here, I have a little bottle of Viagra that just kind of lands, right in the screen, because that's what she's talking about. And it's funny. But it's the kind of funny we don't see with English translations, because our translators do their best to make Bible look more like what we think Bible should look at. And so they engage in an enormous amount of erasure of what is crude, what is raw, what is quite, no longer anywhere close to PG, and which is humorous as a result, so we don't see the humor there. And of course, she also says, God has brought me laughter. Everyone who hears will laugh with me. These are cases where her laughter is actually the kind of joy. And I want you to know that that exists. Along with all the dark, difficult laughter, she is actually talking about the laughter of surprise, the laughter of joy, to have that child at that age. And I don't know if you know of anyone who has suffered from wanting desperately to have a child and then dealing with the pain and the anguish of what appears to be one barren year after another. But I used to have a congregant who tried for close to 15 years before, in her 40s, she was finally able to have a child. And could she identify with that laughter? Absolutely, she could, right? Because it's a laughter of disbelief and joy at the same time. And it's beautiful, right? It's a beautiful kind of laughter. All right, humor at the very beginning. So, I went online looking for children's depictions of, or sort of toys that would depict all the animals in the world. So you've got a really funky looking koala up there, along with the cutest penguin I ever saw. I mean, really adorable, and a panda bear and all that stuff. But we have to remember that at the beginning in the Genesis story, which, by the way, if we ever had time just to go through the second Genesis story, you'd find out that it is packed full with burlesque and humor and crazy, funny moments. Like, it is truly hilarious if you're reading in Hebrew that God mumbles and grumbles and fumbles his way, and I use the his deliberately here, through the text, to the point where, like, what are you doing in the middle of the garden, where I basically planted the thing I told you not to touch, like as if he doesn't know, right? Or this really hilarious moment later in chapter 3:22. Oh no, now that they've eaten from that tree, they might eat from that one. We better kick them out, right? If you read this in the Hebrew, it's pretty funny stuff. But this particular text is actually, believe it or not, hilarious. So let's read it and find out why. Lord God said, "It's not good for man to be alone. I will make a fitting helper for him." So out of the ground the Lord God formed every animal of the field and every bird of the air and brought them to the man to see what he would call them. And whatever the man called every living creature, that was its name. The man gave names to all cattle and to the birds of the air and to every animal of the field. But for the man there was not found a helper as his partner. Why is this funny? Imagine you come from a completely different culture, completely different. And God says, dude, we need to find you a partner. Now I'm going to line up all these animals, and we'll figure out which one works. Why does God not understand the plumbing of the human being he has just made? Because I know that there are animals that were paraded before Adam that probably would have been uncomfortable as partners. Right? Just imagine Adam saying goodnight to a porcupine. This text is actually considered so hilarious by the rabbis. They have a midrash, a commentary on it, where they say, yeah, he actually did try them all out, and no fitting helper was found, right? And it's a hilarious moment. That's burlesque. Like, you would think that God would know that the lion and the lamb and the porcupine and the panda and the penguin were not going to work for what he himself created. So there's this humor in this because these texts were often texts that were told around campfires that were, almost like folk tales, even fairy tales. And they have a lot of burlesque as a result. Now you can go home and imagine Adam trying out all the animals and then see if Bible is ever the same. Probably not after that. Okay, when the text makes you smile, yeah, when the text does that for you. So Esther, right? Like at the very beginning, everybody is celebrating and there's a 180-day feast that the king has had, and everybody's drinking and partying down. This is like half a year of spring break. You just want to imagine what kind of alcohol is being consumed and what kinds of hijinks people are probably getting up to. And after that, there's another 7 days of festival and fun in the palace. And the king literally makes a rule. There are no restrictions. Get as drunk as you want. I mean, that should be a moment where you go, whoa, that's pretty funny to imagine all of Susa tottering around completely drunk for days and days on end. No restrictions at all. And every man could drink as much as he wanted. And then there's that interesting story. Remember where Vashti is supposed to come and present how beautiful she is to the king and his drunken courtiers. And she says, Does Vashti show up? No, thank you. Yes, a moment where a female character actually just says no. She doesn't get away with it, of course. I mean, she gets banished. She gets written out of the story. She gets punished for it, but she does do it, which is its own kind of amazing thing. But the result of that, if you go back to the text, is that the king and all of his men sit around and go, oh my God, now that the queen has said no to the king, if word gets out, we are in serious trouble. And why would we be in serious trouble? Because all the men of the kingdom are going to hear that a woman flouted the king's command, and that means none of us will have the power, the control, and the ability to tell our women exactly what they should be doing. We are in trouble if word gets out like this. We got to do something. So can you imagine all these men, put it on a screen, oh no, what do we do? What do we do? And what do? They send out an edict. And what is the edict? Women shall be appropriately behaving to their husbands. The king has to issue a statement about how women should behave in order to protect the men of the kingdom from misbehaving women. That is actually pretty darn funny. And in fact, the whole fact that Ahasuerus, for the entire story of Esther, is going around saying, a woman's going to tell me what to do, and then he gets told by every woman all the time what he's going to do. Esther tells him what to do. Right? He never makes a single decision for himself, for the most part. Remember that story? It is constantly presenting you with opportunities to laugh, right? So we have a situation where we're going to tell all the wives to treat their husbands with respect, high and low. That we have to send out a kingly edict for this shows how powerful, how strong, and how macho our king is, and our men in the heterosexual world, right? That's pretty funny. There are all sorts of aspects of Esther where things constantly go topsy-turvy all the time, right? Haman comes in and the king says, what should I do to honor somebody who's done something good for me? And then Haman lists all the things that one should do. And then the king says, cool, bring in Mordecai. And Mordecai's the one where all of these things happen. And Haman has to kind of parade him around with the king's robes on and all that jazz, right? So this constant switching of turning around what you expect to happen and then having the unexpected happen. Haman builds the stake for Mordecai, but it's Haman who's hung on it. Now, again, this is somewhat dark humor, but still, it does give you a kind of a way to think about how are these texts giving us laughter. It is, however, really important that you have at least the opportunity to think about where is a text, because Chuck asked you to bring your romantic side today, and if most of my students come up and say, oh, Dr. Thiede, where is romance in the Hebrew Bible? I'll go, romance is a kind of a modern idea. Love, the way we think of it as partnership and as romantic in nature, is not really an idea that's prevalent in the ancient world the way it is in our world. So things operate differently. But every now and again, you get both humor and love and even what might be a tinge of real romance. And here it is. Here, heaven knows why, we actually have some Hebrew. So you apparently have this particular font. Thank you to your computer. And what happens? So we have both a kind of interesting moment of divine attention, and we have humor, and we have love, all in these verses. Raising your eyes. You probably know the I lift up my eyes unto the hills from whence cometh my help. That phrase, to nasa, right, to lift the eyes, is understood as a direct attempt to ask for God's guidance or to connect with God in the heavens. And so Rebecca raises her eyes, but she's on a camel, and she's therefore a lot higher than Isaac, who's walking around in the fields. So it looks kind of like she's raising her eyes to God here. And what happens? She alights from the camel, the text says. Once again, the translators are having an interesting moment with you, because the actual word here for alighting from the camel, she tifers, and that comes from the shoresh nafal, which means to fall. She falls off the camel. Given what happens afterwards, I have always said, after I discovered this, that Rebecca was actually falling in love. Right? Because who does she see? She sees Isaac. And then we have one of the most tender moments that I know of in Hebrew Bible. There are many tender moments in Psalms, but this moment for me is an absolutely, it never fails when I read it for me to go, oh, gosh, right? Isaac, who has just been through the most horrible nightmare anyone can imagine, a father taking him up the mountain and apparently being willing to sacrifice him at his own hand, and coming home to discover that his mother has died, right? So he now is in a space where we can only imagine a father who's nearly betrayed him in the worst possible way, and his mother is gone. I can't imagine much worse source for real trauma. And when this text says that he takes Rebecca and loves her, and because of that love, he finds comfort after his mother's death, right? Brings her into his mother's tent. I don't know how you can be failed to be moved by that idea, right? That there's some association with both loss and mourning and grief and a renewed chance at life. And as dark as Hebrew Bible often is, and as often I speak to you about its dark sides, this is a moment which is so tender and so loving. I mean, you know, it's hard not to do a little, finally a moment where you could just take in something loving, and there will be nothing I'll have to say that will dent its tenderness. Isn't that a nice change for you? Rabbi Barbara is not going to say, and there's the dark side to this. There isn't, other than his loss of his mother. And for those of us who remember what it is to lose someone close to us, who know what that is, and who know how that never goes away. Before I came here, I was thinking, mentally, who am I dedicating this session to? And I can't even tell you why, but my mother-in-law was the person who popped into my head, right? Because I miss her. I miss her so much. And her son's Hebrew Jewish name is actually Menachem, which means to console. I don't think we were thinking of this story when that happened, but it's interesting, right? All right, so love. Now, outside of the Song of Songs, the reason that I didn't try to do Song of Songs with you is because it's complicated. Song of Songs is a complicated text because, first of all, both Jewish and Christian tradition has interpreted this as a love song between God and God's people. And we'd have to spend a lot of time landing what is actually going on in that text from biblical perspectives, which is not that particular image, and which has some pretty interesting and scary dark sides to it, which include the female persona of those stories being attacked in the night and possibly even raped. So that's a charged text. It is also a text that does include a lot of beautiful erotic language. So we'd have to spend an entire session just kind of getting into the weeds about the Song of Songs. So I thought, let's stay with the narrative texts. The word is used, love, 252 times in those narrative texts to describe a relationship between a man and a woman. So largely in these contexts, it's often used in this very standard sort of heterosexual way. And with one exception, that love is third person, masculine. He loved her. It's about a man loving a woman. And only one exception to that rule is Michal, who is described as loving David, right? Because everybody loves David. I'm going to write a song about this. Everybody loves David. You know, it's going to just, yeah. Anyway, so love does not actually precede intercourse or marriage. It is described in Hebrew Bible as the outcome. It's after, frankly, the act that then love is described. The act precedes the love. And that's like completely counterintuitive for us, right? We like to imagine that love is what is first happening, the emotional tie is first happening, and then people get into bed with each other. But in Hebrew Bible, it's people get into bed with each other, a man takes a woman, and then he loves her. There's a lot we could say about that. So maybe we will during discussion. Love is expressed for children and friends and kin and neighbors and strangers. We have these texts about loving our neighbors or loving our children. Those things are part and parcel of love in Hebrew Bible. And of course, it is mostly a hierarchical piece. When we find love in the Hebrew Bible, typically it is described in these narrative texts as the person who's in the superior position having love for somebody who is in an inferior position to that person. And of course, that it's not surprising that that is characteristic of God's relationship to God's people, who, by the way, are men. So God's people in the Hebrew Bible, the Am Yisrael, are the men of Israel, but they are frequently figured or personified as female in relationship to the deity. A whole big piece of my third book, and pretty interesting. We could spend an entire time figuring out what that means. Love can be commanded in an interesting way, and I'm going to get back to that in just a little bit. Who can be loved? Well, you know, somebody mentioned the two women that Jacob loves, and here also is kind of a tender moment here. Because of Jacob's love for Rachel, he serves another 7 years, right? You remember that? He does end up taking her as his second wife after Leah, and then he serves Laban for another 7 years. But it just seemed like that to him, which is kind of a nice thing because, you know, 7 years is not an insignificant amount of time. Or I did quote the Song of Solomon, right? This is just there are these lovely texts that come out of here, which are poetic and beautiful and can, especially when they're drawn out of the text, when we know less about the agendas of the biblical writers, can actually become kind and loving texts that we are free to use for our purposes. I know this because long before I ever studied to be a rabbi, or imagined that I would ever do that, or really knew much about Bible at all, decades before that, I married this man in a courtroom in Germany. And he took passages from the Song of Songs, and we read them to each other in front of a judge who was clearly wanted to get on with it. But we did it anyway. And so there is that kind of love. There's also love that is menschy. I want to emphasize that there's a way in which love, and menschy, do we all know what that means, menschy? We don't? I thought that Yiddish word made it into English, but apparently not. To be a mensch is to be a good person, an ethical person. Love that is menschy has to do with ethics, kindness, right? And here's a classic example. The stranger who resides among you, you know, love that person as yourself. This is menschy love. You were strangers. You suffered. You knew pain. Bring that experience to your interaction with the human beings who are around you. We live in a country that is manifestly doing its darndest in so many circles to send exactly the opposite message from this text, that this text is practically an exception to the rule in anybody's mind, right? There's just been a tsunami of texts around kicking out the stranger, making sure the stranger cannot be part of your world, right? Rather than how is it that you actually embrace the stranger and love them? Yeah, that's commanded. Well, and there's always, you can actually love to eat in the Hebrew Bible. Yes, you can. Food can be good, right? Isaac has a certain kind of food that he loves to eat. It's hilarious. That whole scene is also hilarious. The man is said to have weak eyes. He's lying on what appears to be his deathbed, and somehow miraculously he lives decades after this just fine, right? But remember that? Like, he's like, oh, these are the hands. This is the sound of Jacob, but the hands of Esau. And I don't know what, doddering old man. You think he's going to kick off any second. And his son goes off and, marries 2 women, sires 12 children, 13 if you actually count Dinah, the female, and comes back. Isaac's still alive, right? But in that scene, absolutely hilarious moment. And the teaching in the law, I will delight in your commandments. I love the instruction that you give me. I love the learning that you offer me, right? That becomes incredibly key. So many psalmic texts emphasize that. Or wisdom, right? The love of wisdom and knowledge and learning is part and parcel of the Hebrew Bible. Also something, it might be good for us to remember that loving learning, loving knowing, loving exploration, loving discovery, how easy it is to lose that love, right? And to just stop where we are, and to stop learning, and to stop inquiring, and to stop exploring. And of course, there's loving money. We know many people who love money. Some who will sell $399 pairs of golden shoes for money, because clearly they need that money, right? I mean, that too is part of our world as it was then. And it's something for us to think about, that this text says, you know what? A lover of money never has his fill. It's futile. Or as they say, you can't take it with you, right? So what can be loved, part 2. I just chose texts that I thought really emphasize this quality of loving goodness, of loving kindness, loving truth and peace, loving good. What is being asked of us when we are asked to engage in love? So often, what's being asked of us is the most demanding kind of love. How do we raise ourselves and love in a way that changes the world we live in? Isn't just for our selfish needs, isn't just for our emotional needs or our bodily needs, but is for human needs, for planetary needs. What kind of love are we being asked to give to the world? It's extraordinary, really, isn't it? It's huge. And it's so demanding and at the same time so delicious when you see it at work. It's one of my favorite quotes from the Hebrew Bible. What does God require of you but to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly? Every single semester, I ask my students, what are you here to learn from me? What do you think you're here to learn from me in the opening class? And they think it's about data, and they think it's about, acquiring facts or information. And in the end, there is nothing of that I can guarantee that they will remember 2 weeks after they've finished the course. And it doesn't matter. Because what does matter is that they learn humility, right? We can't really learn unless we're humble about what we don't know. We're allowed to say what we think we know. And I want my students and everybody I teach to say what they think they know with as much strength as they've got in them, right? Say what you think you know, but also be aware that whatever you think you know is subject to revision, right? So, there you are, Brian. This is a text that is sung at every Jewish service. And I thought it would be fun for you to hear how it's sung in at least an American Jewish service in Hebrew, but then to hear it sung in English in a way that will change how you experience it. Are you ready? Okay. This is, by the same melody that most American Jews use to chant from Torah. ואהבת את אדוני אלוהיך בכל לבבך ובכל נפשך ובכל מאודך. והיו הדברים האלה אשר אנוכי מצווך היום על לבביך. ושיננתם לבניך ודיברת בם בשבתך בביתך ובלכתך בדרך ובשכבך ובקומך וקשרתם לאות על ידיך והיו לטוטפות בין עיניך וכתבתם על מזוזות ביתך ובשעריך. And you must love Yah, your God, with all your passions, with every breath you have, with every oomph in your body. Take these words which I use to join myself to you today into your hearts. Pattern your days on them, so that your children and your friends and your neighbors will discover Torah learning within you. Make your life into a voice of God, both in your stillness and in your movement. Renew these words each evening and morning with devotion. Bind them as tefillin on your forehead and arms, as symbols and acts sacred to me, or keep them in your third eye. Write them as mezuzot on the entrances to your home, as a sign that all people may discover me as they enter your home and your life. Makes it real, doesn't it? Laughter and love are both real. And while they have their dark side in the Hebrew Bible, while they are not always the romantic, easy things that we would so love to see, neither, by the way, are rom-coms so easy as we would like to see, but they do exist. And the most beautiful places for love, for me, remain places like this. The love that has to do with creating a world of love. That love from biblical texts is the love for me that will always fundamentally matter. And if that love is given over the way that I hope it is given over, then I can stand before my Maker someday and justify my carbon existence. May we all do the same by loving openly, humbly, lovingly, carefully, kindly, generously, and may we also have reasons to remember that it's good to laugh and be happy while we do it. Thank you all. So I guess it'll be next year that we'll do Jezebel, which was the original plan, by the way. Do we have questions, comments, thoughts?
Vern looks like he has.
Brian, who who absolutely foresaw that I was going to end with Deuteronomy.
Yeah. You know, I wish we had a translation. What is there an English translation the way you sang that it has all those words in it? Because I'm looking at the translation up there in my RSV, and it's just not cutting it the way you sang it. You know?
First of all, I can send the way I translated it to you. I frequently, when I'm chanting Torah in services, my people are now very, very used to my saying, all right, I'm going to chant this in Hebrew, and now I'm going to do what we call a free translation, right? Because this is a problem that I've become almost, I would say, obsessed with, which is the way in which for now hundreds and hundreds of years, translators have had a style that sounds like Bible that they want to use, and the way that strips the actual Hebrew language from its raw force, both in beautiful ways and in really scary ways, right? And we get this sort of, can I just be honest, it's deadening, right, in that version, because it's not real. It doesn't feel real to us. And when we put it in words and in phrases that feel real, then we start having a whole new relationship with the text. Now, there is a translation by Everett Fox where he did his best to try and get the cadence of the Hebrew, the rhythm of the Hebrew, and the sort of nature of how Hebrew works. So if you want to look at that, Brian, I can bring it to you so you can take a look at it and see if that helps. And otherwise, if you have a text you want me to like translate for you sometime just for the fun of it, you know, like there's like, remember that session where, you know, the Moabites are like all afraid of those Israelites who are going to come and lick the ground clean and they're going to be like cattle. When I chant that, yeah, oh, those immigrants are going to come our way and they're going to take everything from us, because it's the same idea. Yeah. All of your texts are so much more alive than you know. Okay, what else? Stuff about love or laughter. Be brave. Or as I say, be shy in your own time. Were you surprised by anything? Like, oh gosh.
No, it's just a leading question. I'm just imagining.
He does this, as you know, every time he shows up.
Just imagining Isaac there on this supposed deathbed, right, and the son coming to him, and he still feels the goat skin and says, "Yeah, I recognize that skin and that smell." I can imagine this being performed as a burlesque on a stage. What do you think?
Absolutely. There are lots of Hebrew Bible texts that could be performed as burlesques on a stage. And Genesis 30, I think that's, 20, I'm going to get the chapter wrong, so I'm not going to say it. Let's see, it's 20, I think it's 24. So that one is truly hilarious. And there's even scholars who say, you know, oh, no, Isaac, you can tell that Isaac knows what's going on here, right? Like, goat skin does have a smell. And I honestly can tell you that if you feel a goat skin, it probably doesn't feel like a man who is very hairy, no matter how hairy that man is, right? And so there's also some other moments in that text where there's like this really interesting subtle moments, like your translation, here we go, Brian, will probably say, which of my sons are you, right? That's usually what the translation is for Isaac when he says, which of my sons are you, to Jacob? But the actual Hebrew, mi ata bani, is, who are you, my son? Now, think about this. I often ask my students, did you ever have a parent say to you, who are you? Who are you? Why are you behaving like this, right? Like, there's another possible moment here where Isaac is revealing he knows quite well that's Jacob and not Esau. Who are you trying to pull one over me like this, right? So yes, and then Esau coming in and Jacob leaves, and the very way that people go in and out of the tent is a visually hilarious thing, right? If you actually saw that, if you break that down, who's in the tent, who's outside of the tent, who's going, who's sneaking around. Yes, it is a funny chapter. It really is, yeah. And there, like I said, Genesis 2 is also hilarious. Who is God talking to, right? Oh no. Now what do we do? Right? Or the serpent, going like, oh, come on. Like, he's just afraid you're going to end up like, he's afraid of the competition. Sometimes I've called that whole text the peasant revolt, right? Adam and Eve are just engaging in a peasant revolt against their landlord. Okay. Other thoughts? All right, a half-formed question. Those are the best. They give me lots of room to be silly.
So I'm just thinking how you were describing the traditional relationship between love and sex. So, love came after.
Yeah.
And then just thinking about how God is sort of demanding that the people love him. And there's the text where he's describing how to build the tabernacle. And he's saying, I want them to bring me all these gifts, and I want them to be, but only if they're moved in their heart or something like that.
Yeah.
And so I'm just wondering if there's any application between, God wanting this love, but he's kind of demanding the love, demanding they bring me presents, but only if they want to. And, it's almost like he's like, I just really want to be with you, but you have to do all the stuff first. And so that just seems kind of like backwards, like shouldn't God be doing more for the people rather than the other way around? So I just wonder if there's any relation to that concept of love that you mentioned that sort of it seems flipped on its head from what we would know.
Right.
And why that maybe makes it a little bit more difficult, because I think around that time Moses comes down and they're having a party with a golden calf. So it's not, they're not loving the right God.
Right.
So I don't know that. So the question's not really a question, it's just.
It's an observation,
Yeah,
but a
yeah.
very, very, very good one. So this is where we have to go, back into like the worldview of these writers. And in those worldviews of the ancient world, your deity every deity has its own people, right? Chemosh has his people, and Dagon has his people, and Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, the Israelite deity, has his people. And the key behavior of all the people is to be loyal and to gain glory for whoever their deity is, and to do the law or the commandments of that specific deity. The Israelite deity, as we meet him in the Hebrew Bible, is both incredibly multifaceted. I mean, you have to think about, just imagine like a spectrum of potential behaviors, from tender and loving to really, really scary and destructive. And that is characteristic of all ancient deities, that they are, unpredictable and often quite violent, and their names are often refer to their warrior status or their violent nature. There's like a deity called Pestilence. The Israelite deity's name can either come from a root that means beingness, just being, both past and present and future, but it could also come from a root that means warrior. So does this deity have a relationship in which he himself can also get pretty snippy about, oh, well, they've done it again, right? They didn't behave well. They didn't do the right thing. I'm done with them. And then Moses having to come up and say, don't do that. It'll be bad for your reputation, right? That is also a really humorous moment. God says, oh, yeah, you're kind of right about that. The Egyptians are going to think I'm a wimp, right? So these kinds of things happen. The deity will, on the one hand, say, they want a king. How could they want a king? All right, give them a king. And then we find the king, Saul, no, he's not good enough. That's not the right king. We're going to have another king. And in the meantime, Samuel coming in to say to Saul that the deity never changes his mind. Right? So you have a very complex character in this deity who is demanding, loving and tender, abusive, dangerous, scary. And by the way, if you think that this is just the OT kind of thing, no. I mean, you have Jesus capable of coming in like a warrior in Revelations, with the same imagery of declaring, female characters subject to sexual violence or covered with blood, or I bring, the sword, I'm not bringing peace. I can give you all that stuff too, because that's part of that ancient world's conceptual framework of how deities behave. We have recreated, as we should, the deity of these texts. We have extracted and grown up and matured, presumably, into a world in which the deity that we pray to, I am fairly certain that none of you are praying to the Jesus who says, those who don't believe shall be cast out where there is wailing and gnashing of teeth, right? I'm fairly sure that that's not who you're thinking of when you're praying, right? In the same way that Jews are not thinking of the deity who rages through Judges 4 and 5 and causes massive destruction everywhere, or who drowns the Egyptians in the sea, right? It's our constant, ongoing challenge that we deal with having sacred texts that are not actually giving us what we say we believe in, a simply loving God. They give us a simply loving God, but they also give us a lot of other gods too. Yeah, spectrums. But that's a good way for us to look in the mirror, right? Because everything we see in these texts are real to us in who we are and what we can see of ourselves and our own world right now. In that level, they're very instructive. Yeah. Okay, that was not half-baked at all. Yay. Wonderful. More wonderful observations. Oh, okay, she's got it, Mary.
Mary, yeah.
Yeah, Mary's got a thought. Sometimes I see the thoughts going across your head, right? I just can't read them.
That's true. I do have a lot of thoughts. No, actually,
Good.
somebody asked me a question, which I don't know, because I know we come from a evangelical Pentecostal background, so a lot of this is a lot of new context to us. But when you talk about the Hebrew Bible, in our context, Old Testament, we were wondering if there are things in the Hebrew Bible that are not in the Old Testament as we know it. Does that make sense?
Yes, there are. I mean, one of the things that is most considerably different is the book of Esther. You all have a very nice, pious Esther, who's a good girl. But the Hebrew version, which, is, frankly, in this case, probably an older version than the one you have, which is largely coming out of a Greek translation, where there were additional sort of verses tacked on to make Esther look like a good Jewish girl. No, the Esther that we have in the Hebrew Bible is much more raw. It's more sex, drugs, and rock and roll, I would say. And there are other differences where, like we have two extant versions of the text of Jeremiah, right? There's a different one in these two texts. What really is also quite different is that what you know is the Old Testament, and of course there's also some Christian Bibles where Maccabees, all of these texts show up. Those are not part of the Jewish Bible. So what is included, what is not included also is not exactly the same. But I think the place where the impact is greatest, to be perfectly frank, is on translation. Because Christian Bibles routinely are coming from two big steps away from Hebrew. Because what happened is that first, these Hebrew texts were translated into Greek, and then these Greek versions, the Septuagint is what that is called, a translation done by Jews, but done by Jews who were profoundly influenced by Greek ideas, and so how they translated had some real effect on things, and that translation is the one that tends to be primarily, and that version of the text is grounding most of what's happening in your English versions today. So on the one hand, sometimes the Septuagint version can actually look like maybe more closer to what might have been in the ancient world. That happens rarely, but sometimes, because the Jewish version was also redacted and edited by later scribes. So there's an example in Deuteronomy where a translation is given where God is like talking about, all of the peoples of the earth. This is complicated, it would take too long. But trust me when I say the Septuagint is probably reflecting an earlier version of that story than the Jewish Bible is. But most of the time, scholars assume the Jewish Bible is closer because it's in Hebrew to earlier versions. And of course, now that I've complicated this, there is no such thing as any original version. So if you all think that there's some mythical world out there in which there was an original, pristine version of these texts, no. That's why we have multiple versions of these texts in the Dead Sea Scroll collection, because different communities had different versions. There are even some Psalms that didn't make it into our 150 that were super popular around the time of the Dead Sea Scroll collection. 900 scrolls are represented in that collection. Only 200 made it in to the canon. So lots of texts were considered authoritative, Book of Jubilees, for example, that didn't make it into our canon. So if we are looking at the big, grand scheme of biblical literature in a really expansive way, we're only scratching the surface. And that will blow your mind. Yes. Yes. Have I ever told you what I wanted to do with the Book of Jubilees? No, I've not told you. So the Book of Jubilees starts kind of like Genesis. It sort of looks like the Genesis story for the first about 12 chapters or so. And I've always thought it would be so much fun if I had the money to just like have a scribe write out like 20 copies of the Book of Jubilees on a scroll, and then to sneak into synagogues all over the country, right? And then just like replace it. And then, at the very beginning of the year when we start reading the text, then they open the scroll and the cantor looks down, or the rabbi, whoever is reading, and goes, right? It's sort of the same, but it's sort of not. And that would kind of like implode everybody's idea about what has to be the text that we read. And can you imagine if we put the Book of Jubilees instead of Gideon's Bible in every hotel? We'd blow everything out of the water. It's just like there was a lot more going on in that ancient world than we know in terms of those texts. Yeah. Anything else? That was. If you have any other question, Mary, let me know. Oh, we have one here. Okay. Kyle and Andy have come here to.
So this is an observation more than a question, but
Sure.
thinking about Adam naming the animals,
Yes.
to me, it always felt like letting your 3-year-old name your dog. It's like there are good reasons to do it, right? Because it makes the 3-year-old active in the family. It gives them a role to play, lets you know what they're thinking, what's important to them. But also, if you've ever spent time with 3-year-olds, it's really funny. Like,
Yes.
you get a dog named Pancake or whatever, right? Like, that's always just been hilarious to me to imagine like what Adam must have been thinking about when he was naming these animals, and how hard God must have been trying not to laugh right in his face.
Yes, and there's like some really funny moments where later, like after, there's a lot of people in the rabbinic tradition that ask, where was Adam during that whole conversation with the serpent? Like, where was he? And they conclude that Adam and Eve had sex and Adam fell asleep. Because that's what dudes do. Right? And so she was bored and lonely and said, oh, someone to have a conversation with, finally. Right? So, these are like these hidden moments where we don't even know how much humor is possible. And the rabbis also say when God goes to Abraham after Sarah laughs and says, dude, did your wife doesn't believe that I'm going to make her pregnant. Does he repeat that Sarah said, with my husband too old? God does not. He only repeats the part that says she doesn't think she can bear a child. It's like, let me protect his masculinity here and his honor and not let him know that his wife doubts his ability to get it up, right? Like, buddy guys, they're having this conversation, and the rabbis ask, why did God not report exactly what Sarah said? And they say, for shalom bayit, which is a principle in Jewish thinking, right? What you have to do to keep peace in the house. That's why God did it, because otherwise Sarah and Abraham would have had like a big fight. Yeah, and no baby. Or potentially they have a big fight and they make it up afterwards, because that often happens too in our sort of imagination, and the miracle occurs after the big battle. Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
I just have a comment. I have a new appreciation of why there are so many famous Jewish comics now. You being one. I once taught an entire course on, I used to teach a course on Judaism, and I got so tired of teaching the same thing over and over again. Here's ritual, and here's the text, and here's and then of course the requisite, Jewish suffering kind of component. So I decided to teach the entire semester on Jewish humor. I thought this was going to be great. I was going to have Mel Brooks and, all this stuff, and we were going to watch funny movies. And I came into class every single day with a joke, right? A Jewish joke. And it was the worst failed semester of my life, because I was teaching mostly at that point white Southern kids, and they completely did not get the humor, because the humor is very, very dark, right? Really, really dark, often, at least, especially in Ashkenazi European. So, yeah, look, when you live for 2,000 years, more or less, generally needing to pack your bags and go at a moment's notice, you must have a sense of humor, right? Because, the world is continuously at risk of falling apart. On the one hand, on the other, there we are, Fiddler on the Roof moments. So, yes. Hold on.
She can't talk.
Yes.
I've been watching a lot of David Attenborough, and I've always thought God had an amazing sense of humor.
Put that right near your mouth.
All right.
There we go.
Who in the world would create a male penguin who then has to carry an egg on his feet and walk like this for half a year, starving to death, to have another penguin? How ridiculous. And you look at the way some of these things mate and dance to each other and so forth, and it's just hysterical.
All creation is filled with absurdity.
It is. It's
yes.
amazing.
Yes.
Yeah.
Who know, it is a humorous world, absolutely, and we could all afford to laugh more often than we do. And I would want to tell you that as we are approaching this next election cycle, I think we're all going to need desperately to have reasons to laugh, because otherwise we're going to spend most of our days crying. Yeah. So, yeah, David Attenborough is a good place to start with laughter. Yeah. Other thoughts? Well, my friends, I will say this much. We postponed Jezebel, who I was going to have kind of a fun time telling you, nah, she's not at all who you thought. We'll do her some other time. And there's also, I also really want to encourage you, because you all know that I not only do After Dark every year, but I also come and teach you different things in the summer. So if there's let's do the Book of Ruth and complex stuff in the Book of Ruth, or let's have Rabbi Barbara come in and talk about the Song of Songs. You have a voice that you haven't exercised. You've generally just been my willing victims. And, that's nice. But if there's something you would like to study that we haven't covered, then the person to speak to will be one of two people. One will be the Reverend Nancy Cox, who is the most amazing, delightful person you could be blessed to have as a spiritual leader. And she will, I am sure, be thrilled to get a list of 10 things that we wish we could do. And for After Dark, if she is still doing it next year, although repeatedly on my walks with her, I say, like, is it time to let somebody else try doing this? The woman right behind you, Debbie Smith, who has every single year done so much to make this whole event happen, and who cannot possibly ever be thanked enough for the work she puts into it. I see that from the inside, and it is far more than you could ever imagine. But as long as she's still doing it, you can go to her. But right now, I would say, as long as she's here, it would be cool if we turned around and said, thank you.
Thank you, Debbie.
And Chuck, of course, who's been helping out and introducing me and helping arrange things in his own way, too. So there you are. It's a little bit after Valentine's Day, but I would like you all to just carry a little bit of the love and laughter with you out of this room and into the world, and remember that love is the thing that can really and truly make the most fundamental difference in a world that needs it a lot. Thank you all, and be well.
Thank you, Barbara.
We can chit-chat, or we could just start the Mr. Dr. Thiede's thing a little bit early. Debbie actually has had the wonderful moment where recently our son was visiting because I was doing a pretty important lecture at UNC Charlotte, and she joked about next year having Dr. Thiede, and Dr. Thiede line up, and our son is a theoretical chemist. So don't, because he has an idea. He wants to talk about science and Bible, right? And, environment and Bible. Thank you. Environment and Bible. So if we can bring him down, we will do that, though I shall warn you of two things. One is that when he was at this talk, he met a lot of my students and did not tell them who he was. And they thought he was just another student, and then he revealed all sorts of interesting things about me, apparently, while talking to the students, including, no, she wouldn't want you to buy her book. And that is actually true, because the first book that they were selling is way too expensive. I would want them to get it from the library, where it's easily available through electronic means, and they don't have to pay for it. So he was absolutely dead on about that. But yeah, so if he comes down, he could say things about his parents that you would never have necessarily wanted to know. Anyway. Or I wouldn't want you to know, yes, so you can't be sure about that. But yeah, if there are questions generally, since we don't want to interrupt people about Bible or biblical literature that you would like to throw out here, I guess we've got 10 minutes, so we can do it. Is that a question or a stretch? And a stretch. Both, we have a question and a stretch. Okay, Chuck, you still have that microphone somewhere? Because apparently we still need it. All right, hold on a minute. And it can be anything, she says dangerously. Uh-oh. And then she's going to ask something. I'm going to go, oh, no idea.
No, it's for her this time.
Okay. All right, Rebecca.
I don't know how to word this, but
Without disclaimers.
from my understanding, Eve ate of the tree, and nothing happened
That's correct.
until Adam ate from the tree, right? And from my understanding too, that God commanded Adam not to eat of the tree before Eve was even born,
That is right.
created.
That is right.
So why is everybody picking on Eve?
Wow. I love that question. All right, so there are multiple ways to think about this. One way is actually, do we have, all right, this will complicate things really, is there sexual differentiation when Adam is given this instruction by God in Genesis 2:17? So the name Adam comes from the word Adamah, which means earth, and in Hebrew there are no capital letters, little letters. So it's by context that you see that a word is a name. So you could potentially read that second Genesis story as saying this human creature, this earth thing,
This clod being is how Phyllis Tribble, I think, translates it, right? This thing of earth is walking around and at this point is not male or female, but just a human being. Oh my gosh, could we think about that? Like just a being. And that therefore, when the deity then performs surgery and then does a little sexual differentiation, effectively Eve, who is in this being like Adam is, they both got the message. So that's one way of reading that. And, you know, is it more likely that the biblical author thought of Adam as male and Eve as being this subordinate, or at least this literally side gig of God's? Likely. However, let's assume for a moment that we do have the dude given the instructions and the woman not given any information from God's self. You notice that she changes the instructions that she's given, right? She doesn't say, we were told, you know, if we eat of it, we're toast. She says, we're not to eat or touch of it lest we die. So she introduces this very interesting uncertainty moment. We're going to come back to that because I think that is important, right? She doesn't give us exactly what the deity told Adam. All right, so she eats, and then she gives the fruit to Adam, who apparently wakens from sleeping or whatever, and he eats, and they don't die. And the Hebrew where God says, you eat of this, you're toast, is really pretty unequivocal and very strong. It's using a particular grammatical construction for emphasis. You do this, and in that moment, you are done for. Now, both Jewish and Christian readers have done everything they could to try to excuse God and figure this out by saying, oh, no, really. Let's take a look at this psalm text. A day in God's life is as 1,000 years in a day of a human's life. And so therefore, God didn't really mean in that moment. God meant 1,000 years later, and Adam lives till like 900, whatever. They make this problem. The person who wrote the psalm text never read the Genesis 2 text. This is a complicated story, but in terms of when these things were written, it just doesn't work. Well, actually vice versa. The one who wrote the Genesis story would not have been able to read the psalm text because it was written much later. And the Hebrew is pretty unequivocal. It's like in that moment, in that second, you eat your toast, and it doesn't happen. So one of the things that I've always wondered, Martin Buber wrote this most beautiful phrase: behind every prediction of disaster is a concealed alternative. Behind every prediction of disaster is a concealed alternative. When Naomi says, I'll never be able to give you another child, you can't have the lever, this is never going to happen, you know, goes on and on about how her line is gone. By the end of the story, there was this concealed alternative, right? And her line is not gone. Does Eve, in the moment that she says, we're not to eat or touch of this lest we die, giving God kind of a opening, right? Not to inflict death as a punishment. I don't know. But when God gets to punishing everyone, and by the way, the serpent is the only one who's cursed, neither Adam nor Eve are cursed. He curses Adam and Eve with effectively the same thing. No, this is a whole nother thing. We could do this a whole nother time. It is not cursing Eve with subordination and male dominance over her. It is not what the Hebrew says. We can have that conversation another time. It's been translated in ways that are just have had such awful repercussions for women for 2,000 years. It's just will make me crazy. He punishes both of them with the same thing: very hard work and a really tough life in the real world. She's going to have to go through a lot of pregnancies to have living children. He's going to have to work ground that will no longer be like the Garden of Eden and just give them the food that they need. They're in for a tough time. So they get punished in a way that is actually pretty commensurate. What have we done with this text? We have made Eve at fault in ways that biblical readers and biblical audience
might not have done. They might have been more likely to see both Eve and Adam as mutually responsible, since the punishment is mutually similar, right? And so what you are dealing with right now, Rebecca, is millennia of really interesting interpretive moves made predominantly, albeit blunt, by Christianity, but some also by Judaism, that have effectively created a binary reading in which Eve is the source of temptation and Adam is the poor guy who just, ended up somehow suffering along with her. But that's not in the text. Of course he could have, and he doesn't. That's right. And you can interpret this as a story of her needing and wanting knowledge, because what is it that the tree of good and evil gives them? It gives them knowledge, it gives them learning, it gives them experience. Yes, they're going to have to go out in the real world and then figure out how that real world looks. But her motives are not to and the one thing about this evil piece, last thing, really important, is that the fruit itself is not intrinsically evil. There's nothing evil about it. The reason that you all think it's an apple and that it represents evil is because St. Jerome translated the Hebrew word for fruit into the word malum, which in Latin can mean both apple or evil. And so your translations got this association with the apple as being a source of evil. In the Hebrew, that's not the case. The fruit is the source of knowledge of good stuff and bad stuff. But nothing is intrinsically evil. Nor, by the way, is there any ever moment where the word sin is used in this text. There's nothing that comes close. There's none of the three words for sin ever shows up here. So the reading of this story as a story of sin and a story of evil is a later interpretation which has affected deeply the way that we read Eve, and she deserves better. By God. Yes.
Oh, wait.
Yeah.
I'm not ready.
How would someone have interpreted?
That story?
Yes.
How would somebody
have
have interpreted that?
Yes. How would somebody even? Well, of course, let me also say this is another hopping moment. Who's the somebody? Is it a male somebody? Is it a female somebody? Are we male and female in binary ways? Or are we actually talking about somebody who might not even inhabit that? Because the ancient world has a gender, that's elicited on spectrums too. So, and is this somebody who is elite, or is this a farmer dude who's here in the story, right? So, are there multiple interpretations of every possible story in Hebrew Bible? Of course there are, because the text itself is what we call cryptic. It's not didactic. It doesn't tell you a given standard moral. It opens up possibilities for you because it leaves so much unsaid and in between the lines, right? A version of potential interpretation is that human beings, and this is characteristic of the ancient Near East, and after this I will let you go, but in all of ancient Near Eastern literature, there's a ton of stuff around human beings wanting to be like the gods. And the way that they want to be like gods is by acquiring either divine wisdom or eternal life. Gilgamesh, right, goes on a search for all these things, and there's a serpent in his story too, right? And a plant that's going to give him eternal life, and the serpent goes and eats it, so too bad for Gilgamesh. But he certainly tries. The myth of Adapa, same thing. Adapa ends up before the god Ea, and Ea, a sub-god, Enlil does this kind of trickery thing, tells him, don't eat anything. If you eat anything, you're in trouble. Well, the very things that he was offered to eat would have given him that eternal life. So this is a thematic issue about human beings that has to do with ancient peoples trying to figure out what is the difference, what distinguishes humanity from the divine. In what ways are humans always aspiring to get ahead of themselves? Story of Babel, right? To reach for things they shouldn't. And this story is so classically along that line, right? Remember that God says, oh, they ate from the tree of knowledge. What if they eat from the tree of eternal life? Why did you put the trees there to begin with, right? Like, because that kind of thematic question of the relationship between what is human, what is divine, is classic for this world. So I would say that's how most people would have interpreted it. Human beings aspiring for things they shouldn't. Yeah. And then a whole story that comes after. Yeah. Wow. All right, thank you so much. Thank you all again. And now I think we're allowed to be released into the parlor without disturbing anyone. We are released. Thank you so much, Alice. Have a wonderful, wonderful Sunday, all of you. So appreciate you. Well, at least it wasn't, the usual doom and